Imagine walking into Independence Hall in Philadelphia, right? Like the literal birthplace of American liberty, the actual room where the Declaration of Independence was debated.
Right, the heart of it all.
Exactly. And you're walking in and you realize someone has literally unbolted a piece of the history right off the walls.
Yeah, just completely gone.
Like you were looking for this specific exhibit, the one about the 9 people who were enslaved by George Washington at the president's house, and it's simply not there anymore.
And, it was removed by federal workers. It wasn't an accident or a renovation. It was a direct result of this sweeping executive mandate to completely alter how the country presents its own past.
Yeah, that jarring image is exactly where we are starting today. We are looking at a massive, controversial, and honestly, incredibly intricate blueprint to rewrite American history.
It really is a massive blueprint.
It is. We have a dense stack of source material today for you, specifically anchoring on this extensive HuffPost article from June 2026. The title is, Trump is completely rewriting Black history with devastating consequences.
And the reporting in this piece, I mean, it spans everything. It covers presidential executive orders, the curation of the Smithsonian museums, all the way down to like the actual names painted on the signs at military bases.
Ah, yeah.
And even the demographic data being collected by Ivy League universities. It maps out this highly coordinated top-down effort by the Trump administration and aligned groups to dramatically alter the presentation of United States history, specifically, concerning slavery and racism.
And look, because we are diving into a deeply sensitive, highly politically charged topic today, we need to be crystal clear with you about our mission here. We are acting purely as your neutral, impartial guide through the contents of this specific article. Like, we aren't here to endorse the viewpoints presented or to take a political side or validate any of the actions described. Our job is just to break down the mechanics of the claims, the quotes, and the timelines exactly as the HuffPost source material presents them, so that you can understand the architecture of the argument that's being made on the national stage right now.
And the core of that argument really is that history is not a static object. It's not just a bunch of dates that you memorize in a textbook. According to the text, the way a nation curates its history directly dictates its future policies. The administration is actively using the past as this foundational justification to dismantle modern civil rights legislation in the present.
Which is wild to think about. To really understand the sheer velocity of the shift this article describes, you kind of have to look at the whiplash of the last few years. The text points to Juneteenth as the baseline. We all know Juneteenth marks June 19th, 1865, when the last enslaved people in Texas finally learned they were free, which was, what, 2 full years after the Emancipation Proclamation?
Yeah, 2 full years. But the critical context the article provides here is what happened recently in 2021.
Right.
Following the massive racial justice protests in 2020, President Joe Biden signed a law making Juneteenth a federal holiday.
Which was a huge deal.
It was, because for over a century, it had just been a localized community remembrance. But in 2021, the federal government elevated it to the absolute highest level of national civic acknowledgement. That represents a really profound institutional recognition of Black history and the legacy of slavery.
Which makes the pivot detailed in the source material so stark. I mean, you go from establishing a federal holiday acknowledging the end of slavery directly into an administration that is systematically removing references to that very same history.
Yeah, it's a complete 180.
It really is. And the catalyst forcing this massive ideological clash into the public square, it isn't just theoretical. There is a hard deadline looming over all of this.
Right, the upcoming 250th anniversary of the United States.
The semi-quincentennial.
Exactly. The article highlights how this monumental anniversary is acting as an accelerant for all this narrative warfare. We're seeing two entirely competing visions for how to celebrate the nation's founding, and I guess more importantly, how to frame the 250 years that followed it.
Let's get into those competing visions. The piece contrasts the officially sanctioned planners, which is a congressionally approved body called America 250, with a MAGA-aligned group called Freedom 250. And it's this alternative group, Freedom 250, that provides the clearest distillation of this historical revisionism. They put out this 85-page document designed for a student art contest. 85 pages profiling historical American heroes.
And curating an 85-page document, I mean, that is an exercise in intense editorial discretion. You are making very deliberate choices about what you highlight and what you obscure.
Yeah, what makes the cut and what gets left on the cutting room floor.
And the text notes that this document does actually include prominent Black historical figures. It features Frederick Douglass, it features Sojourner Truth, Booker T. Washington is in there.
But And this is a big but. Here's the mechanism of the revisionism the article exposes. How do you frame the lives of people who were literally born into chattel slavery?
That's the core question.
Right. According to the HuffPost piece, the document frames these individuals purely as patriots who possessed a can-do spirit.
Think about the linguistic gymnastics required there. We are talking about individuals who survived human bondage, people who escaped a system of legal torture, who risked their lives to lead underground networks, and who pushed the nation into a bloody civil war just to force the recognition of their basic humanity. To distill that harrowing survival down to a can-do spirit, it severely sanitizes their lived reality.
Okay, let's unpack this for a second. A can-do spirit
Okay.
for surviving chattel slavery. I mean, that sounds like the rhetoric you would find in a mid-level corporate performance review, not a historical account of human bondage. It really begs the question, like, what exactly are these students being taught about the obstacles these patriots overcame?
Well, the statistics the article pulls from the document answer that question perfectly. In an 85-page educational curriculum profiling individuals who were enslaved, the word slave appears exactly once.
Once.
The word slavery appears exactly once.
Out of 85 pages. And what about the word racism?
Completely absent. It does not appear a single time in the entire document.
I am genuinely struggling to understand how you even structure a biography of Frederick Douglass without explicitly detailing the institution he dedicated his entire life to destroying.
It's a glaring omission.
It's like telling the story of a legendary superhero without ever once acknowledging the villain. The heroism makes absolutely no sense. The triumph loses its entire context. Like, if there is no systemic racism, if slavery is barely mentioned, what exactly was Frederick Douglass's can-do spirit pushing against?
The achievements become entirely divorced from the resistance that defined them. They just become these generic examples of perseverance rather than specific survivors of a targeted race-based system of oppression. And the text emphasizes that this Freedom 250 document isn't just some isolated fringe educational experiment. It is a perfect mirror of the official policy directives rolling out of the Oval Office.
Yeah, the philosophical approach of that 85-page document was actually codified at the highest federal level back in March 2025. President Trump signed an executive order, and honestly, the title alone tells you everything you need to know about the administration's framing.
What was the title again?
Restoring Truth and Sanity in American History.
Right. The rhetoric within that order is vital to analyze here. The text quotes the administration, claiming there has been a concerted and widespread effort to rewrite our nation's history, replacing objective facts with a distorted narrative driven by ideology rather than truth.
From the administration's perspective, teaching the comprehensive history of systemic racism is the distortion. They are framing the inclusion of that history as the ideological rewrite.
They go even further than that. The order states that this focus on darker historical chapters deepens societal divides and fosters a sense of national shame. And to counteract this, a White House spokesperson, Taylor Rogers, told HuffPost that the administration is stopping efforts to cater to left-wing ideology aimed at diminishing American achievement. The stated goal is restoring a sense of national pride.
Okay, so you can really see the binary they're setting up here. Acknowledging slavery and racism equals left-wing ideology and national shame. But erasing those elements and focusing on a, can-do spirit equals objective facts and national pride.
But the article introduces a massive counterargument to this logic through Brian Stevenson. He's the co-founder and executive director of the Equal Justice Initiative. He fundamentally rejects the premise that you can just carve out the parts of history that make people uncomfortable and still have a functioning national narrative.
Because Stevenson argues this isn't just about erasing Black history. He says it's fundamentally altering American history as a whole. You literally cannot explain the United States without explaining slavery.
He points out the sheer scale of the institution's impact. Hundreds of thousands of people died in a civil war fought directly over the issue of slavery. The constitutional amendments that redefined citizenship and rights in the 20th century, those were a direct response to the aftermath of slavery. He states, and this is a direct quote, "To not be honest about that history just creates a misunderstanding of who we are as a nation."
I mean, it is like trying to explain the structural integrity of a skyscraper without ever mentioning the steel beams. If you just pretend the steel isn't there because you don't like the way it looks, your entire understanding of how the building stands up is completely fictional.
That's a really good way to put it.
And the article shows how this debate over historical architecture quickly moved from reading materials and executive theories into a direct physical assault on the nation's premier institution.
Because that March 2025 executive order was almost immediately deployed as a bureaucratic weapon against the Smithsonian Institution, which is, the world's largest museum complex.
And the Smithsonian is heavily funded by tax dollars, which puts it squarely in the crosshairs of federal executive oversight. The administration's explicit claim, rooted in that executive order, is that the Smithsonian has fallen under the influence of a divisive, race-centered ideology.
The specific target of their ire, according to the text, is the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which opened back in 2016. And the article notes that this museum tells an incredibly multifaceted story of Black Americans. It covers massive cultural, scientific, and societal contributions. But it also provides a very comprehensive, unflinching history of slavery in the U.S.
And it seems like that comprehensive coverage of the atrocities is exactly what triggered the crackdown. The HuffPost piece points to an August 2025 Truth Social post by President Trump that perfectly encapsulates the administration's grievance here. He claimed the Smithsonian was out of control, complaining that the museums only focus on how horrible our country is, how bad slavery was, and how unaccomplished the downtrodden have been.
And he specifically demanded to know why there was nothing about success, nothing about brightness, nothing about the future.
If you are a museum curator and you are bound by historical accuracy, how are you supposed to inject brightness into an exhibit detailing the Middle Passage or the auction block? Like, if a federal government demands a museum alter its historical exhibits to be inherently more positive, at what point does it stop being historical curation and start becoming state-sponsored propaganda?
What's fascinating here is how Miriam Rashid from the Center for American Progress addresses this fundamental incompatibility in the article. She points out the absurdity of the demand. She says, it's egregious to talk about owning another human being, and I don't know how somebody can spin it in a good light.
Because you cannot put a sunny, optimistic filter on chattel slavery. The two concepts are violently opposed to each other.
And yet, that is the exact mandate being forced onto the institution. The White House didn't just complain on social media, they launched a massive formal review. The logistical demands of this review, as outlined in the source, are designed to create immense pressure. The administration demanded the Smithsonian turn over all materials related to any content the public sees, plus all documentation regarding their internal curation processes.
Everything.
Everything. And anything related to their upcoming America 250 programming.
And the leverage they're using to enforce this is just massive. It's the threat of catastrophic budget cuts. The article notes Trump explicitly threatened the institution's funding for failing to comply with the new narrative demands.
Which is terrifying for a museum.
If you are a museum complex relying on federal dollars, that is an existential threat hanging over every single placard you write.
The chilling effect of that threat is profound. Even before a single exhibit is physically altered, the massive scrutiny and that financial gun to the head fundamentally change the environment. Curators are forced to second-guess historical accuracy in favor of, well, political appeasement.
But the battle over the narrative didn't stay confined behind the glass cases of the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. The text details how the federal government began flexing its control over the physical landscape of the country, moving out into the national parks.
Yeah, that March 2025 executive order provided the direct authorization to actually dispatch National Parks service workers to begin physically dismantling historical exhibits across the country.
Which brings us back to that image we started with at Independence Hall. The article details how workers literally uninstalled an exhibit memorializing the 9 Black people enslaved by George Washington at the president's house.
The significance of that specific removal cannot be overstated. Independence Hall is the crucible of American liberty. The exhibit explicitly highlighted the profound central contradiction of the American founding. These were men who espoused universal liberty while actively holding other human beings in bondage.
Removing that exhibit is like ripping out the load-bearing walls of a historic house to make it look prettier. The visitors walking through Independence Hall now get a pristine, uncomplicated story of freedom. The house looks immaculate, but it is completely compromised. It is built on a lie of omission.
Miriam Rashid is quoted again making this exact point. She argues that replacing accurate information with revisionist history, or just entirely ignoring the populations that built the country, is a massive disservice to park visitors. They are essentially being handed a fundamentally inaccurate map of the past.
And the erasure extended far beyond Philadelphia, too. The article outlines removals at Harpers Ferry National Historic Park in West Virginia. Park employees there were instructed to remove information detailing abolitionist John Brown's 1859 raid.
And John Brown attempted to initiate an armed slave revolt. By removing his history, the administration isn't just erasing the victims of slavery, they are actively erasing the history of violent resistance against the institution.
Wow. And the third example the text provides is arguably the most visceral one. At an unnamed park in Louisiana, workers were slated to remove a very specific photograph. It is an image of the severely scarred back of an escaped enslaved man, often known historically as Whipped Peter.
That photograph is one of the most famous, undeniable pieces of visual evidence documenting the sheer brutality of slavery. Removing it speaks to a very specific psychological tactic. When you take away the visceral, physical reality of the torture, the history of slavery is pushed back into the realm of the abstract.
Oh, I see. If the park visitor doesn't have to look at the mutilated flesh, it becomes much easier for them to swallow the can-do patriot narrative the administration is pushing. An abstract concept is easy to minimize, but a photograph of a back destroyed by a whip is impossible to ignore.
Exactly. Now, the article points out that these physical removals triggered immediate legal pushback. The city of Philadelphia actually sued the federal government over the Independence Hall exhibit. And federal judges intervened, blocking the administration and ordering the reinstallation of historical and scientific displays while the lawsuits proceed.
So we have a literal tug of war happening in real time. The executive branch dispatching workers to strip the history off the walls, and the judicial branch issuing orders to screw it back on.
But as the text transitions from the national parks to the military, we see that this narrative warfare isn't just about erasing the horrors of slavery. It is equally focused on actively restoring monuments to the very people who fought to preserve that institution.
Yeah, this brings us into the incredibly complex history of the Lost Cause and the battle over military base names. To really wrap your head around the loophole the Trump administration used, the HuffPost article provides this vital historical context on how the South reacted in the decades following the Civil War.
Right. After the Confederacy lost the war and the institution of slavery was finally abolished, former Confederates and enslavers engaged in a deliberate, massive effort to romanticize the pre-emancipation South.
Because they had just lost a devastating war fought to maintain human bondage. They desperately needed a new narrative to justify their cause and explain their defeat to future generations without relying on the indefensible reality of slavery.
And this effort birthed the lost cause of the Confederacy. The article explicitly defines this as an ahistorical myth. It was a fabricated narrative claiming that slavery was not the primary catalyst for the Civil War. Instead, they reframed the conflict as this noble, heroic defense of states' rights and Southern heritage against Northern aggression.
And the text points out how wildly successful this rhetoric was. By the early 1900s, this romanticized fictional version of history had taken deep root across the country. It resulted in the proliferation of monuments honoring Confederate soldiers everywhere. And many of those monuments, as the article notes, still dominate the landscape today.
The landscape was intentionally seeded with the physical markers of a false narrative. And that century-old myth is the direct predecessor to the modern conflict detailed in the text regarding U.S. military installations.
The article explains that in late 2020, Congress finally passed a law banning military bases from being named after insurrectionists. The Biden administration oversaw the project of stripping the names of Confederate generals from these massive federal installations.
But President Trump actively campaigned on pushing back against that exact project. The administrative hurdle for him, however, was that the 2020 law banning insurrectionist names was still on the books.
So they couldn't just overtly break the law. They had to find a legal loophole to restore the Confederate legacy without technically violating the statute. And the mechanism they used, as described by the source, is just astonishing. The administration restored the old Confederate names by finding entirely different service members who simply happened to have the exact same last name.
The text highlights Fort Bragg in North Carolina. It was originally named for Confederate General Braxton Bragg. Following the 2020 law, it was renamed Fort Liberty.
But then the Trump administration announced they were reverting the name back to Fort Bragg. Their official, technical justification was that the base was now being named in honor of a World War II soldier whose last name was also Bragg.
It is a remarkable administrative sleight of hand.
It is exactly like taking an old, deeply offensive banned book, wrapping a brand new, completely innocuous dust jacket around it, and sneaking it past the censors. You can point to the dust jacket and claim, look, this is a completely different book. It's a biography of a WWII hero. But the censors, the people who put the dust jacket on and the people buying the book, they all know exactly what text is printed on the pages inside. The technical legal justification was swapped out, but the symbolic intention remained identical.
The article provides a quote from President Trump that removes any ambiguity about that intention, too. Speaking at a rally at the base to a crowd that was actively booing the name Fort Liberty, he didn't spend his time extolling the virtues of the World War II soldier.
No, of course not. The text quotes him telling the cheering crowd, "Can you believe they changed that name in the last administration for a little bit? Fort Bragg is in, that's the name. And Fort Bragg it shall always remain. That's never going to be happening again."
He was explicitly celebrating the restoration of the name the crowd wanted, the name indelibly tied to the Confederate legacy, completely disregarding the administrative loophole they used to justify it on paper.
This connects directly back to a powerful insight from Miriam Rashid in the text.
Hmm.
She looks at this century-long timeline and says, that's why we're in the position that we're in. We provided that little in after the Civil War where we allowed people to tell history inaccurately.
She is drawing an unbroken line from the creation of the lost cause myth in the late 1800s straight to the executive actions of 2025 and 2026. Because the nation permitted that false narrative to flourish after the Civil War, that same mythology retains enough cultural power to be wielded as a political tool today. The leniency granted to historical inaccuracy a century ago is the direct fuel for the administrative loopholes being exploited right now.
Which brings us to the absolute most consequential shift in the entire article. We've spent a lot of time today talking about museums, park placards, and the names painted on military signs. It is really easy to view these as purely academic battles over how we remember the past.
But the source material makes a far more alarming argument than that. This curation of history is not an end in itself. According to the text, it is the foundational prerequisite for dismantling modern civil rights policies.
So what does this all mean for the present day? Sarah Weichsel, the executive director of the American Historical Association, spells out the danger with brutal clarity in the piece. She says, if you work with an incomplete past, you aren't able to shape the future in ways that are based on historical evidence and understanding.
Weichsel lays out a very logical, chronological sequence of historical cause and effect here. She argues that if you don't understand the reality of slavery, you cannot possibly understand the unrest and the specific challenges of the Reconstruction era following the Civil War.
Right, and if you don't understand Reconstruction, you won't understand why violent white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were created to terrorize Black communities.
And if you are ignorant of that century of violent subjugation and systemic disenfranchisement, then in Weichsel's words, you are not going to understand the need for a civil rights movement.
It is a deliberate domino effect. If you pull out the first domino like the unvarnished, brutal truth about slavery and systemic racism, the entire chain of subsequent historical events loses its context.
And without that context, the civil rights movement and the legislation it produced transforms. It goes from a necessary, hard-fought struggle for survival against state-sanctioned oppression into a seemingly unwarranted demand for special privileges.
And that specific reframing is exactly what the article links to the Trump administration's modern policy actions. The text details what it calls the administration's war on colleges, specifically targeting elite Ivy League institutions over their admission policies.
The administration is vehemently attacking affirmative action. Now, affirmative action is a landmark civil rights policy designed to make tangible progress on racial equality, an equality necessitated by the exact centuries of systemic oppression we have just been discussing. But the administration, according to the source, is decrying these policies as an effort to harm white people.
The article highlights a quote President Trump gave to the New York Times in January that perfectly illustrates this mindset. He claimed that white people were very badly treated, arguing they did extremely well academically but were not invited to go into a university to college. He concluded by stating, "So I would say in that way I think it was unfair in certain cases."
That quote is the ultimate manifestation of Sarah Weichsel's warming. By actively ignoring the centuries where Black Americans were legally barred from education, wealth accumulation, and basic civil rights, the administration can frame policies designed to correct that immense historical imbalance as inherently unfair and discriminatory against white Americans in the present.
The erasure of the history is what makes the policy argument viable. Like if you convince the public that the past was just full of can-do patriots and brightness, then any modern policy aimed at fixing systemic racism naturally looks like reverse discrimination.
And the administration isn't just making rhetorical arguments about this. They are deploying massive federal leverage to force these independent universities to comply. The article outlines a severe policy threat hanging over these elite institutions.
Yeah, the administration is threatening to pull federal funding from these schools unless they meet a set of specific ideological demands. The text says they must turn over comprehensive student demographic data. They must alter their academic programming to align with the administration's policy goals. And explicitly, they must prioritize admitting white and conservative students.
Let's really look at the mechanics of the leverage being used here. We are talking about the immense power of the federal purse.
It's massive. It is essentially like a massive bank walking into a successful independent business and saying, we are going to pull your entire line of credit and bankrupt you immediately unless you completely rewrite your founding charter, change the products you offer to align with our CEO's personal philosophy, and fundamentally alter the demographics of the customers you see. They're using the threat of financial annihilation to forcefully engineer the social demographics and academic thought processes within independent educational institutions.
It is an extraordinary exertion of federal power to mandate a specific ideological outcome. If you step back and look at the entire strategy laid out in the text, the architecture is undeniable. If you successfully reframe the last 250 years of American history in a MAGA-friendly light, a narrative that minimizes slavery, deletes the word racism, and demands a focus on success and brightness, the historical context that justifies civil rights legislation completely evaporates.
The prerequisite for the policy reversal is the historical erasure. If you change the map of the past, you can justify driving the country in a completely different direction in the future.
To fully grasp the magnitude of how the United States is handling its darkest chapters, the article forces us to look beyond our borders. It suggests we evaluate the American approach against how other nations have navigated similar historical reckonings.
Yeah, the text contrasts the U.S. model with two very specific international examples: post-WWII Germany and post-apartheid South Africa.
Mm.
Both are nations globally synonymous with horrific, state-sponsored atrocities and systemic racism.
And the article points out how radically differently their subsequent governments handled the aftermath of those atrocities compared to the U.S. After the fall of Nazi Germany, the new government didn't try to mandate national pride by ignoring the concentration camps. They mandated comprehensive, unflinching education about the horrors of the Holocaust for all citizens. The state took active, perpetual responsibility for ensuring the atrocities were never minimized or forgotten.
And South Africa took a very similar path. When the brutal system of government-sanctioned racial segregation known as apartheid finally ended, the new regime prioritized the creation of museums and institutions that detailed the country's racist history in explicit terms. They recognized that acknowledging the undeniable truth of the past was the absolute prerequisite for building a stable, unified future.
But the HuffPost article asserts a stark, uncomfortable truth. The United States has never had a similar reckoning. We have never mandated a comprehensive national confrontation with the reality of slavery and its aftermath.
Think about the American model described in the article and apply it to post-WWII Germany for a second. Imagine if, after the war, Germany had allowed former high-ranking officials to simply rebrand their actions as a defense of state pride or heritage. Imagine if they had permitted monuments to their generals to be erected in city squares across the country, and if a future leader demanded that museums stop talking about the dark parts of the past to prevent a sense of national shame.
It is completely unthinkable. The international community would view it as an outrageous, terrifying continuation of the atrocity itself.
Yet, the article posits that this is essentially the exact blueprint of what happened in the post-Civil War United States, which raises the massive question, why? Why is the U.S. so radically different in its failure to reckon with its foundational sins?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Brian Stevenson provides the explanation in the text, and it is arguably the most crucial, illuminating insight in the entire piece. He says, I think people in this country have been reluctant to talk about this because the people who benefited from slavery continued to be in power after the Civil War. The people who benefited from terror violence and Jim Crow laws never had to give up power.
That quote is the absolute linchpin. It explains the mechanical difference between the U.S. and those other nations. Let's really look at what Stevenson is arguing here.
Right. In Germany and South Africa, the regimes that perpetrated the atrocities were entirely overthrown. The power structure was completely dismantled and replaced by those who had been oppressed or those diametrically opposed to the oppression.
The architects of the system were forcibly removed from the building.
And Stevenson is pointing out that in the United States, after the Civil War and again after the Civil Rights Movement, there was a profound, uninterrupted continuity of power. The individuals and families who benefited immensely from the oppressive systems remained in positions of massive economic, social, and political influence.
They kept their hands firmly on the levers of power. And because they retained that power, they retained the means to shape the national narrative.
Exactly.
They had the capital to fund the Confederate monuments. They had the political influence to shape the textbooks. They had the cultural authority to cultivate and legitimize the lost cause myth.
That unique continuity of power is the culturally fertile ground that allowed a false narrative to take root over a century ago. And Stevenson's point is that it is that exact same fertile ground that is nourishing the executive orders, the museum reviews, and the university threats happening right now in 2025 and 2026.
The map was drawn by the people who desperately needed to hide the bodies. And now, generations later, we are surprised that we are completely lost when trying to navigate the terrain of civil rights.
It is a devastatingly clear through line from the aftermath of the Civil War directly to the policy debates of today.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. We have covered a massive amount of ground today, tracking the intricate arguments and timelines laid out in this June 2026 HuffPost article.
We really did. We started with the Freedom 250 document, analyzing the rhetoric that sanitizes surviving slavery into a generic can-do spirit. And then we moved into the mechanics of the March 2025 executive order, demanding truth and sanity by equating the history of systemic racism with national shame.
We looked at how that executive mandate was weaponized to threaten the Smithsonian with catastrophic budget cuts, forcing a demand for brightness over historical accuracy. We examined the physical removal of exhibits concerning enslaved people and violent resistance at national parks from Independence Hall to Harper's Ferry.
We unpacked the administrative loophole used to circumvent federal law and restore Confederate names to military bases like Fort Bragg, echoing the century-old lost compass myth.
And finally, we saw how the source material ties all of this historical curation directly to the justification of modern policy shifts. By erasing the historical context of systemic oppression, the administration is attempting to dismantle civil rights policies like affirmative action, using the immense leverage of federal funding against elite universities.
It is a comprehensive, unsettling look at how controlling the narrative of the past is viewed as the absolute key to controlling the policies of the future.
As we wrap up, I want to briefly reiterate our mission today. We have spent this time mapping out the arguments, the quotes, the mechanisms, and the historical context, exactly as reported by the HuffPost source material.
Right.
Our goal was simply to help you understand the complex architecture of this major national debate, entirely independent of our own personal views or political leanings. We are just showing you how the article maps the landscape.
And as you process this incredibly dense landscape, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. We constantly hear the old adage that history is written by the victors. But looking at the profound ongoing conflict over the source material we've unpacked today, it raises a fascinating question for you to explore on your own.
What's that?
What happens to a nation's identity and its ability to govern itself when society fundamentally disagrees on who won, who lost, and what the battle was even about in the first place? If the past is treated as a rough draft that can always be aggressively rewritten to suit the political needs of the present, how do we ever agree on a shared reality for the future?
That is the crucial question at the heart of the map. If we can't agree on where the mountains and rivers were yesterday, we have absolutely no hope of navigating tomorrow.